80 American airmen flew 16 B-25 bombers off the deck of the USS Hornet on April 18, 1942, launching the first American air raid on the Japanese home islands of the entire war. By the time the mission's final chapter closed, more than 3 years later, these 80 men had scattered across an almost unbelievable range of individual fates, some evading capture through weeks of desperate trekking across occupied China with the help of local villagers. Some interned for over a year in the Soviet Union, some captured and executed by Japanese forces, and the vast majority eventually finding their way home to build entirely ordinary post-war lives after having flown one of the most extraordinary single missions of the entire war. This is the story of what actually happened to the pilots who flew the first raid on Tokyo, and how radically different 80 men's individual wartime journeys turned out to be after they had all launched together from the same carrier deck on the very same morning. Here is the question worth carrying through this story. How do 80 men who flew the exact same mission, launched within minutes of one another from the same ship, end up living 80 almost entirely different versions of the war that followed? The 80 men who flew the mission had trained together for weeks at an airfield in Florida, under conditions of considerable secrecy, before ever learning the specific nature of the target they were preparing to strike. A shared training experience that forged genuine bonds among crews who would, within days of the actual mission, find themselves scattered across an enormous and unpredictable range of individual circumstances, a contrast between their unified preparation and their radically divergent actual outcomes that would define how the surviving raiders understood their own collective identity for the remainder of their lives. The mission's broader strategic significance, examined in this channel's earlier coverage of Yamamoto's response to the raid, extended well beyond the individual fates of the 80 airmen themselves, since the psychological shock the raid delivered to Japanese military and political leadership directly influenced the planning decisions that led to the Battle of Midway just weeks later. Meaning the specific human story traced in this episode, of 80 men scattering across China, the Soviet Union, and Japanese captivity, unfolded against the backdrop of a mission whose strategic consequences reached far beyond what any of the participants themselves could have anticipated as they climbed into their aircraft on the Hornet's deck. The Doolittle raid's basic outline is well known. 16 modified B-25 bombers, launched from the carrier Hornet at extreme range after the task force was spotted early by a Japanese picket boat, struck targets across several Japanese cities before continuing on toward China, since the bombers, while capable of taking off from a carrier deck, could not land back aboard one. What is less commonly understood is just how much the mission's early, forced launch, hundreds of miles further from the planned landing fields than originally intended, compromised every crew's fuel margin for the flight's final and most dangerous leg, setting up 80 individual and individually uncertain landing situations once the bombing runs themselves were complete. Most of the 16 crews, flying on fumes by the time they approached the Chinese coast, made the decision to bail out by parachute over eastern China rather than attempt a landing with critically low fuel in darkness and deteriorating weather, scattering 80 men across a wide swath of Chinese countryside, much of it under at least partial Japanese military presence or influence, with no guaranteed friendly reception waiting for any of them on the ground. Several crews, rather than bailing out entirely, attempted crash landings along the Chinese coast or in accessible terrain where the pilot judged an emergency landing offered better survival odds than parachuting into unknown territory in darkness. Decisions that carried their own distinct risks, including the possibility of a landing severe enough to cause serious injury even if it avoided the specific dangers of a night parachute descent into unfamiliar terrain, a choice individual pilots had to make in the final minutes before their fuel ran out entirely, based on whatever limited visual information they could gather about the terrain below in the darkness. For the majority of the raid's airmen, survival and eventual return to safety depended almost entirely on the assistance of Chinese civilians and nationalist guerrilla forces operating throughout the region where the crews came down, ordinary villagers and local resistance fighters who took in exhausted, injured, and disoriented American airmen, often at very real personal risk, and helped guide them across contested and dangerous territory toward areas of more secure Chinese government control. This assistance effort, repeated in dozens of individual instances across the scattered landing sites, represented one of the more remarkable and, this channel has noted in an earlier episode covering the raid's darker aftermath, ultimately most costly acts of civilian courage of the entire Pacific War, since Japanese forces would later launch a brutal retaliatory campaign against exactly the communities that had provided this assistance. Language barriers added a further layer of difficulty to nearly every crew's escape effort, since almost none of the American airmen spoke Chinese, and most of the Chinese civilians and guerrilla fighters assisting them spoke no English, meaning much of the coordination required to move injured, exhausted airmen safely across contested territory depended on improvised communication, gestures, occasional interpreters found along the way, and a basic mutual trust that developed despite the absence of any shared language, a testament to the depth of goodwill many Chinese communities extended to the stranded American airmen, despite the very real danger that assistance represented for the villagers themselves. Individual crews' specific journeys to safety varied enormously in both duration and danger, some men reaching secure Chinese-held territory within days of bailing out, others spending weeks trekking through mountainous, difficult terrain, evading Japanese patrols and relying entirely on a chain of local assistance passed from village to village, a journey that, for several of the raid's participants, proved nearly as physically demanding and dangerous as the mission itself had been. Some injured airmen required extensive medical care during their journey to safety, treatment provided by whatever combination of local Chinese medical practitioners and improvised first aid the American crew's own training had prepared them to administer to one another. Since professional medical facilities capable of treating serious combat or crash-related injuries were often days or weeks away from the remote areas where many crews initially came down, meaning the specific severity of any individual airman's injuries could dramatically affect both the difficulty and the danger of his particular journey back to secure territory. Stop and consider the specific and genuinely unusual fate that befell one particular crew, because it diverged entirely from the pattern most of the mission's airmen experienced. Captain Edward York's crew, running critically low on fuel and recognizing they could not realistically reach the planned landing area in China, made the decision to divert instead towards Soviet territory, landing near Vladivostok in the Soviet Union. Rather than being welcomed as an ally, York's crew was interned by Soviet authorities, who, bound at this stage of the war by a formal neutrality agreement with Japan that remained in effect regardless of the Soviet Union's alliance with the United States and Britain against Germany, held the American airmen in a form of extended custody rather than immediately returning them to American control. The crew's specific living conditions during this extended internment period, while considerably less harsh than the brutal treatment Japanese captors inflicted on the two crews captured elsewhere in China, still involved genuine hardship and restriction, held in a form of custody that, while not a conventional prisoner of war camp, denied the crew any meaningful freedom of movement or communication with American authorities for well over a year, an ambiguous legal and diplomatic status that left the men uncertain, for extended periods, about exactly when or how their situation might eventually be resolved. This internment stretched on for more than a year, a genuinely strange diplomatic limbo in which American airmen who had just flown a combat mission against a country the Soviet Union was not yet at war with found themselves detained by a nominal ally, a situation eventually resolved in 1943 through what several historians examining declassified records have described as a quietly arranged, semi-official Soviet-facilitated route allowing the crew to make their way out of Soviet territory through Persia, modern-day Iran, and eventually back to American control, an unusual diplomatic resolution that avoided the more direct embarrassment either government might have faced from a more openly negotiated release. The specific route through Persia required careful, quiet coordination between American diplomatic personnel and their Soviet counterparts, a resolution achieved without either government publicly acknowledging the awkward reality that a nominal wartime ally had held American military personnel in extended, unexplained custody for well over a year, purely to preserve its own separate neutrality arrangement with Japan. For viewers who have not yet seen this channel's earlier dedicated episode covering the captured airmen's specific ordeal in full detail, it is worth briefly summarizing here that the 8 men captured, Lieutenant Dean Hallmark, Lieutenant William Farrow, Sergeant Harold Spatz, and 5 additional crew members, faced a Japanese military tribunal built around retroactively fabricated war crimes charges, a legal proceeding designed from the outset to produce convictions rather than any genuine judicial inquiry into their conduct. 2 of the 16 crews came down in areas of China under direct Japanese military occupation rather than the more secure territory most of the mission's airmen reached, and the resulting capture, tribunal, and execution of several of these 8 men represents the specific and deeply tragic chapter this channel has already examined in considerable detail in an earlier dedicated episode. A story involving a fabricated retroactive war crimes charge, 3 executions by firing squad, 1 additional death from the harsh conditions of continued imprisonment, and 4 men who survived years of captivity to see eventual liberation at the war's end. What is worth adding here, beyond the earlier episode's detailed coverage, is the specific way these 2 captured crews' fate connects to the broader story of the mission's 80 participants. These men had trained alongside every other raider through the same weeks of secretive preparation in Florida, launched from the same carrier deck on the same morning, and flew comparable bombing runs against comparable targets. Meaning the wildly divergent outcome they eventually faced, compared to crewmates who landed only a relatively short distance away in more secure Chinese territory, came down almost entirely to the specific, largely unpredictable circumstances of exactly where each aircraft's fuel ran out and exactly which patch of Chinese countryside happened to be under Japanese versus friendly control at that specific location. This darker outcome for a small minority of the raid's participants stood in stark and painful contrast to the considerably more fortunate fates that awaited the majority of their fellow airmen who had, through some combination of landing location and available local assistance, avoided Japanese capture entirely. The immediate aftermath of the mission, before the full scope of individual crew fates had become clear to American commanders back home, involved a genuinely uncertain period during which military leadership had only fragmentary and delayed information about which of the 80 airmen had survived at all, let alone which specific outcome, safe return, Soviet internment, or Japanese capture, individual crews had actually encountered, a fog of uncertainty that persisted for weeks, and, for the families of some airmen, considerably longer, as confirmed information gradually filtered back through military channels. Jimmy Doolittle himself, having bailed out over China along with most of his fellow airmen, initially believed the mission had been a significant operational failure, having lost every single one of the 16 aircraft involved, with no realistic prospect of any of them being recovered. A material loss that, by his own later account, left him genuinely expecting a court-martial upon his eventual return to the United States, rather than the celebrated reception that would actually await him once the raid's true strategic and propaganda significance became apparent to American military leadership. President Roosevelt himself, in the raid's immediate aftermath, deliberately maintained public secrecy about exactly where the bombers had launched from, famously telling reporters only that the mission had originated from Shangri-La, the fictional hidden location from a popular contemporary novel, a piece of calculated wartime misdirection that added to the raid's mystique and public fascination, even as American military leadership worked through the more serious business of assessing the mission's actual strategic value and determining how to recognize the men who had flown it. Instead of facing disciplinary action, Doolittle received the Medal of Honor and a promotion, going on to command major American air campaigns in both North Africa and Europe for the remainder of the war, a career trajectory built directly on the reputation the Tokyo raid had established for him, despite his own initial private assessment of the mission as a costly and largely unsuccessful operation. Doolittle's own later reflections on this rapid reversal, from expecting a court-martial to receiving the nation's highest military honor within the span of just weeks, reportedly left him with a lasting, somewhat wry appreciation for how dramatically the same set of facts, 16 aircraft lost and 80 men scattered across enemy and neutral territory, could be interpreted as either catastrophic failure or historic triumph, depending entirely on the broader strategic and propaganda context surrounding the mission's execution. The surviving Doolittle raiders, The overwhelming majority of the mission's 80 original participants returned to conventional military and, eventually, civilian post-war lives, many continuing military careers through the remainder of the war and into the post-war decades, others returning to entirely ordinary civilian occupations, far removed from the extraordinary single mission that had briefly made them nationally famous in the spring of 1942. Many of the surviving raiders, in post-war interviews and memoirs, described a shared and enduring sense of connection to one another that transcended the wildly different individual paths their wartime experiences had actually taken, a bond several veterans attributed specifically to the unique, shared circumstance of having trained together in secret for a mission whose full historical significance none of them could have fully appreciated at the time, only to be scattered by circumstance into such radically different subsequent experiences of the same war. In the decades following the war, the surviving raiders established a tradition of annual reunions, gatherings built around a specific and deeply personal ceremonial object, a set of silver goblets, each engraved with an individual raider's name, with the goblet of any raider who had died in the intervening year ceremonially turned upside down at each subsequent reunion, a tradition that continued for decades as the group's surviving membership gradually and inevitably shrank. The goblet ceremony itself, conducted with careful and deliberate formality at each annual gathering, involved a specific set of 80 silver cups, each bearing an individual raider's name inscribed both right side up and upside down, a design allowing the goblet to be physically inverted upon that raider's death, as a permanent, visible marker within the group's own private collection of the mission's steadily diminishing roster of living participants, a tradition several surviving raiders described in later interviews as carrying a weight and significance that grew more pronounced with each passing year and each additional goblet turned. This tradition continued until the group's final surviving members held what became known as a last formal toast in 2013. An emotionally significant gathering marking the point at which so few of the original 80 airmen remained alive that the group's leadership determined the annual reunion tradition itself could not meaningfully continue. Cole's own post-war life, like that of most surviving raiders, involved a lengthy continued military career followed by a long, comparatively ordinary retirement, and his eventual status as the mission's last living participant brought him a level of renewed public attention and historical significance in his final years that several of his fellow raiders, who had died decades earlier, never experienced in quite the same way, a somewhat bittersweet distinction that Cole himself, in interviews conducted shortly before his own death, reportedly approached with the same modest, unassuming manner that had characterized his decades of largely private post-war life following the extraordinary mission of his youth. Richard Cole, who had served as Doolittle's own co-pilot during the original mission, became the last surviving Doolittle raider, living until 2019, more than 77 years after the mission that had briefly, on a single morning in April of 1942, brought 80 men together for one of the most audacious and consequential single air raids of the entire Second World War, before scattering them across a genuinely remarkable range of individual wartime fates that few of them could have predicted as they climbed into their aircraft on the deck of the Hornet that morning. Remember the question this story opened with: how do 80 men who flew the exact same mission, launched together from the same ship, end up living such radically different versions of the war that followed? The honest answer, traced across this episode's account of Chinese rescue treks, Soviet internment, Japanese captivity, and Doolittle's own unexpected path from anticipated court-martial to Medal of Honor, is that it came down almost entirely to circumstances no one aboard those 16 aircraft could control or predict in the moment. Exactly where a given crew's fuel ran out, exactly which patch of ground happened to be friendly or hostile territory, and exactly how the broader war's strategic currents happened to treat a single, audacious mission in the weeks and months that followed its execution. If you want to understand how 80 men who flew the exact same historic mission ended up living such radically different versions of the war that followed, from Soviet internment to a Chinese rescue trek to a Medal of Honor and, for a tragic few, execution, this is the story worth knowing in full. Subscribe to Pacific War Tales for more long-form World War II history from the Pacific Theater, told with the names, the dates, and the details intact.